April 17, 1943. 27,000 feet above Lorient, France. The air was razor-thin, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in seconds. The roar of 4 Wright Cyclone engines thundered through the aluminum frame of the Boeing B-17 Mary Jane, vibrating every rivet, every bolt, every bone of the 10 men inside. Captain Robert "Bob" Gaines gripped the control yoke, his gloved hands stiff with frost. Oxygen hissed through his mask as he peered through the narrow glass of the cockpit. Below, the French coastline spread like a shattered mirror, riddled with flak bursts that bloomed black against the pale blue sky. Flak, 3 o'clock high. The shout came from Lieutenant Harris, the co-pilot. Gaines adjusted slightly, trying to keep formation, one of 21 B-17s in the 303rd Bomb Group, their target, the U-boat pens at Lorient. The intercom crackled with static and clipped voices. Tail to pilot, fighters. Bandits at 6 o'clock, closing fast. Then came the familiar scream of German engines, the Bf-109s, diving out of the sun. The Fortress shuddered as tracers ripped past the fuselage. "Waist, keep your fire tight," Gaines barked. The air gunners responded with bursts from their .50 caliber Brownings, their barrels glowing dull red. Sergeant Mason in the tail turret swore. "I got one smoking. He's going down," his voice cut off as a cannon shell slammed into the starboard wing. The plane lurched violently to the right. Warning lights flared across the cockpit panel. Engine 3 was gone, shredded. "Feathering 3. Harris yelled, twisting the prop control. The propeller stopped spinning, locked to reduce drag. The Fortress began to lose altitude. Gaines wrestled with the controls. "Hold her steady. She'll fly on 3. And she did. The B-17 groaned, bleeding speed but holding formation. A dozen holes gaped in the fuselage. Hydraulic fluid leaked from a line near the nose. Yet the aircraft stayed in the sky, dragging itself across the French coast with grim defiance. When they finally reached the English Channel, the surviving crew stared in disbelief, half the formation limped home, engines coughing, wings shredded. But they were alive. The Mary Jane touched down at RAF Molesworth with 2 engines dead, 1 hydraulic system blown, and 300 bullet holes counted in the skin. A crew chief on the ground shook his head in awe. "That damn thing shouldn't be flying," he muttered. Gaines only smiled behind his oxygen mask. "That's why they call her the Flying Fortress." What few knew that day was that this indestructible machine, this fortress of aluminum and courage, had begun as little more than a wild dream. A dream so bold that even Boeing's engineers once doubted it could fly. And the man behind it wasn't a general, nor a politician, but a stubborn, imaginative designer who believed that one aircraft could change the very nature of war. Seattle, Washington. July 28, 1935. The morning sun glinted off the polished aluminum fuselage of Boeing's latest experiment, a massive, 4-engine bomber unlike anything the U.S. Army Air Corps had ever seen. On the airfield at Boeing Field, a small crowd of engineers, military officers, and reporters gathered to witness a test flight that could redefine air power, or end Boeing's future entirely. Standing a few paces from the plane, Chief Engineer E. Gifford Emery and his young assistant Edward Curtis Wells exchanged anxious looks. Beside them, project manager Robert Minchell wiped his hands on his coveralls, staring up at the monster he and his team had built, the Boeing Model 299. It stretched across the runway like something from the future, 103 feet of wingspan, bristling with gun mounts, powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney ARC-1690 Hornet engines. Reporters whispered nicknames already circulating: the flying battleship, the monster, the giant. But one journalist from the Seattle Times looked at it, stunned, and said, "Gentlemen, that's a flying fortress." The name stuck. Inside the cockpit, test pilot Major Ployer Peter Hill, a calm, methodical Army Air Corps officer, ran through the pre-flight checklist. Mixture rich. Prop set. Flaps to 15. His co-pilot, Boeing's Les Tower, responded with quiet precision. The engines roared to life, one by one. The entire crowd felt the deep vibrations in their chests as the plane lumbered down the runway. For a moment, it seemed too large, too heavy, like it would never leave the ground. Then, smoothly and gracefully, the Model 299 lifted. She climbed with confidence, circling above the field as sunlight flashed off her silver wings. Below, Emery exhaled. Wells grinned. They had done it. But the real triumph wasn't just in flight, it was in philosophy. The Army had requested a new bomber capable of carrying 2,000 pounds of bombs over 2,000 miles at 200 miles per hour. Boeing had gone far beyond that. The Model 299 could carry 5,000 pounds, reach 250 miles per hour, and climb higher than any bomber before it, all while defending itself with 5.30 caliber machine guns. It was an airplane designed not to escape the enemy, but to fight its way through. The flight that day lasted just over an hour. It landed perfectly. Reporters rushed forward, taking photographs that would appear in newspapers across the country the next morning. The Army officers on site, including Lieutenant Colonel Ira Eaker and Major Frank Armstrong, exchanged knowing looks. They had just seen the future of aerial warfare. But behind the scenes, not everyone was convinced. At the Army Air Corps headquarters, procurement officers balked at the cost. The competing Douglas B-17, a twin-engine design, was far cheaper, simpler, and already proven in flight. And then, in October of that same year, tragedy struck. During a follow-up demonstration at Wright Field in Ohio, the Model 299 began its takeoff run, but the flight crew forgot to disengage the control locks. The aircraft lifted briefly, stalled, and crashed in a fireball at the end of the runway. Major Hill and Boeing's Les Tower were killed instantly. The wreck burned for hours, the smell of oil and charred aluminum lingering across the field. The press quickly turned. Fortress falls, one headline read. Boeing dream dies in flames. The Army cancelled its immediate order. Officially, the contract went to Douglas for the B-18. Unofficially, many officers believed the B-17 concept was too ambitious, too expensive, and too risky. But among a handful of believers, the dream didn't die. In the quiet halls of Boeing's Seattle plant, Emery, Wells, and their surviving engineers refused to give up. She flew beautifully, Wells insisted. That crash wasn't her fault, it was ours. Human error. Not the plane. And deep in the bureaucracy of the Air Corps, one man agreed. Major General Frank Andrews, head of the newly formed General Headquarters Air Force, quietly pushed funding for limited testing. "We'll build a dozen," he said, "and see what she can do." That handful of prototypes would go on to prove a concept no one else believed possible, an aircraft that could cross oceans, carry bombs farther, and survive hits that would destroy any other machine in the sky. It was the rebirth of the Flying Fortress. Langley Field, Virginia, spring 1938. The hangars were alive with noise, the echo of tools clanging, engines testing, and the steady rhythm of boots on concrete. Parked on the apron outside, 12 gleaming Boeing YB-17 stood in perfect formation, sunlight flashing off their silver skin. They were the orphans of an idea nearly killed in infancy, but here, under the command of Major General Frank Andrews, the dream of long-range air power found a second life. Young pilots gathered around instructors, taking notes, tracing outlines of wings and turrets on clipboards. Among them was a wiry captain named Curtis LeMay, who watched intently as the mechanics explained the Fortress's systems. He wasn't just impressed, he was fascinated. "This plane," he murmured to a fellow pilot, "can change everything." Andrews, a visionary of strategic bombing, agreed. He saw beyond the horizon of the 1930s, beyond the idea of bombers merely supporting ground troops. He imagined fleets of flying fortresses striking deep into enemy territory, crippling industries, railways, and morale. Air power, he believed, could decide wars before armies even clashed. That was revolutionary thinking. Dangerous thinking. The doctrine of daylight precision bombing, the idea that bombers could surgically hit enemy targets in broad daylight, relying on tight formations and defensive firepower rather than speed or stealth, was born from this aircraft. To make it possible, the engineers kept refining her. The B-17B introduced self-sealing fuel tanks, a stronger airframe, and enclosed gun positions. The B-17C added armor plating and powered turrets. Each new variant grew meaner, heavier, tougher. By 1940, with war already raging in Europe, Boeing had rolled out the B-17D, capable of carrying 8,000 pounds of bombs and climbing above 30,000 feet, higher than most interceptors could reach. In Britain, Royal Air Force officers visited to inspect the aircraft. Their verdict was mixed. "She's strong," one of them said. "But she's too slow to fight without escort." In Washington, that comment echoed through the halls of the War Department. The Army still believed the fortress could defend itself, that a box formation of B-17s, each bristling with machine guns, would form an impenetrable shield. It was an idea both brilliant and naive. When war came to America in December 1941, the Flying Fortress was ready on paper, but untested in total war. And within months, the world would find out whether the name, Flying Fortress, was prophecy or wishful thinking. June 1942, England. Rain lashed across the airfield at RAF Polebrook. The ground crews of the newly arrived 97th Bomb Group worked in the mud, fitting bomb racks, checking oxygen lines, tightening bolts that would soon hold the fate of men and machines. Their commander, Colonel Frank Armstrong, stood beside his deputy, Major Paul Tibbets, the same Tibbets who would, years later, fly the Enola Gay over Hiroshima. But on this day, he was just another combat pilot about to test an unproven idea. Their mission, the first American daylight bombing raid over occupied Europe. Tibbets glanced at the aircraft, a row of rugged, battle-gray B-17Es with names hastily painted on their noses, Yankee Doodle, Big Stuff, Bat Outta Hell. The crews joked nervously, smoked cigarettes, and wrote letters home. The ground crews called the planes, tough old girls. They didn't yet know how tough. When the engine started, the roar drowned out every thought. For planes lifted into the morning fog, their destination, the railway yards at Rouen, France. At 22,000 feet, the air turned thin, the temperature dropped to 40 below zero. The bomb bay doors opened, and for the first time, American bombs fell on Nazi-occupied Europe in daylight. The raid was small, only a handful of fortresses, but it was perfect. Every bomb struck the target. Not one aircraft lost. Back in England, when the planes rolled to a stop and crews climbed down, mechanics cheered. The reporters who'd been allowed to watch scribbled notes furiously. The Flying Fortress had proven itself. That day, a single phrase began to circulate through the Army Air Forces. If one fortress can do that, imagine 1,000. No one yet understood what it would take to make that vision real, the blood, the loss, the courage it demanded. But the Flying Fortress had found its wings, and soon, it would carry the war straight into the heart of Germany. Schweinfurt, Germany, August 17, 1943. The sky above Bavaria burned like a furnace. Hundreds of silver B-17s filled the horizon, their vapor trails streaking white across the blue. Beneath them, the earth shuddered as the German flak batteries opened fire, rhythmic, thunderous, precise. Each burst of black smoke marked a near miss. Some weren't misses at all. Captain Jack Kavanagh, piloting Misbehavin' of the 91st Bomb Group, watched as the B-17 to his right vanished in a ball of flame. "God Almighty," he muttered, gripping the controls as shrapnel peppered his windshield. In the belly turret, Sergeant Eddie Malone called out through the intercom, "We got fighters. 12 o'clock high, 190s diving." A swarm of Focke-Wulf 190s streaked through the formation, guns blazing. The gunners opened up, a web of tracers arcing across the sky. Tail to pilot. Got one. He's bailing out. But for every German that went down, another appeared. The bombers pressed on, formation holding, engines coughing. There were no escorts. The P-47 Thunderbolts couldn't yet reach this deep into Germany, the fortresses were on their own. Inside Misbehaven, the temperature was 60 degrees below zero. Frost crawled across the gun sights, and blood froze in shallow cuts. The men spoke in short bursts, conserving oxygen. Every sound was muffled by engine roar, every vibration a reminder that one hit, one lucky cannon shell, could tear the ship apart. But still, they flew. Bomb bay doors open, came the call from the lead ship, Memphis Belle's sister plane, Hell's Angels. The moment was pure chaos. Tracers flashed, the bomb bay yawned wide, and through the drifting smoke, Kavanaugh saw the target, the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, glinting in the sun. Bombs away. The fortresses dropped thousands of pounds of high explosives, their payloads whistling downward. Seconds later, the city below erupted in orange fireballs. Black smoke billowed up, mixing with the flak clouds. Then came the turn home. Half the formation was gone. Some had turned back with crippled engines. Others were drifting downward, leaving long, black trails of oil and smoke. "Navigator, how far to England?" Kavanaugh asked through cracked lips. "Too far," came the quiet reply. Hours later, Misbehaven landed in England with one engine dead, the tail shredded, and her left wing riddled with holes. Only 60 of the 230 fortresses that had departed that morning returned intact. In the debriefing tents, the airmen sat silently. Some were pale, others shaking. A colonel walked in, face grim. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "you hit the target." "But the cost," he paused, eyes down. The cost was heavy. That day became known as the First Schweinfurt Raid, one of the bloodiest missions of the war. It proved the fortress could strike the heart of Germany, but also that it couldn't do it alone. For Boeing's creation, it was a test of survival. For the men inside, it was a test of faith. Yet even amid the losses, something remarkable happened, the legend of the Flying Fortress grew. Newspapers back home published photos of shredded B-17s that somehow made it home, tails blown off, wings holed, engines missing. One plane, all American, returned with half its tail sheared away. Another, Ye Old Pub, limped across Europe after being nearly destroyed, only to be escorted home by a chivalrous German pilot who refused to finish her off. His story spread like wildfire. The fortress, the papers said, was indestructible. It wasn't true, but it felt true. And in a war built on morale as much as metal, that mattered. Because the B-17 wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a symbol, of endurance, of defiance, of the belief that no matter how hard the enemy hit, the fortress, and the men inside her, would find a way home. RAF Bassingbourn, England, winter, 1943. Snow clung to the edges of the airfield, melting slowly under the exhaust heat of idling engines. The air was thick with the smell of fuel, oil, and cold metal. Rows of flying fortresses waited like sleeping giants, their bellies loaded, their crews moving in silence. Inside one of the Nissen huts, the crew of Memphis Belle gathered around a pot of weak coffee. The men were exhausted, but their faces showed something else, a quiet determination. Captain Robert Morgan, the pilot, leaned against the table, staring at the mission board. The next day's target, Lorient, again. The 25th mission. The last one. If they made it back, they'd go home. Beside him, co-pilot Jim Verinis joked half-heartedly, "Think she's got one more in her, Bob?" Morgan managed a grin. "She always does." The Memphis Belle was more than a plane, she was a home in the sky. Her fuselage bore the scars of 24 battles, bullet holes patched with tin, scorch marks from near misses, chipped paint around the nose art of a pin-up girl in blue. Each crewman knew every sound, every vibration by heart. The cough of the No. 2 engine at high altitude, the click of the oxygen line at the radio operator's seat, the rhythm of the tail gunner's breathing during a dogfight. At dawn, they climbed aboard. The engines came alive, one by one, their deep thunder rolling across the airfield. As the Fortress began to taxi, the ground crews saluted, a ritual, part respect, part superstition. In the cockpit, Morgan glanced at the worn control yoke. He thought of the first day he'd touched it, how it had felt like holding the reins of a living creature. "Let's bring her home," he murmured. At 20,000 feet, frost glazed the windows. The intercom buzzed with short bursts of chatter. Over the French coast, the first flak appeared, black blossoms against a gray sky. "Here we go," Verena said under his breath. The flak intensified. One shell burst close off the left wing, rocking the plane violently. In the ball turret, Sergeant Quinn cursed, "Feels like they're aiming right for us today." Morgan steadied the yoke. "Just a little longer, boys. Bomb doors in 30 seconds. The navigator called out bearings, the bombardier squinted through the Norden sight, making fine adjustments as the Fortress bucked in the turbulence. Steady, steady. The crosshairs aligned. Bombs away. The release lever clunked. The ship lifted slightly, relieved of its burden. A second later, the sky behind them turned bright orange, direct hits. But celebration came too soon. Bandits. 10 o'clock high. 3 Messerschmitt Bf 109s screamed down in a tight dive. The gunners responded instantly, twin streams of tracer fire converging on the lead fighter. The smell of cordite filled the cabin. The noise was deafening. One German fighter burst into flames and spiraled down. Another broke off with smoke trailing. The third lined up dead ahead, firing cannon shells straight at the nose. Glass shattered. The bombardier ducked as shrapnel tore through the compartment. Bombardiers hit. Miner wound, "He's okay," the radio operator shouted. Morgan didn't flinch. "Hold formation. Don't break." Minutes later, the fighters peeled off. Silence, except for the hum of the engines. The crew exhaled as one. When they crossed the English Channel, Varenus looked over at Morgan. "We did it," he said softly. The airfield appeared below, home. When the Memphis Belle touched down, the men could barely believe it. They climbed out, dazed, dirty, alive. Ground crews cheered. Cameras flashed. The 25th mission was done. For the first time, a B-17 crew had completed its full combat tour, every man alive. War correspondents gathered around, scribbling notes. "How does it feel to be going home?" one shouted. Morgan looked back at his battered plane. The sunlight caught the chipped paint, the hundreds of tiny scars that marked where death had nearly found them. "She brought us back," he said simply. "Every time." The Memphis Belle would soon tour the United States as a symbol of hope. But to the men still flying over Europe, she was more than that, she was proof that survival was possible. That the Fortress could endure. In the months that followed, thousands of other crews would take off in their own flying fortresses, many never to return. Yet each believed in the same truth, that as long as the B-17 stayed in the air, there was a chance to make it home. February 20, 1944, somewhere over Leipzig, Germany. The code name was Operation Argument. The crews called it Big Week. For months, the 8th Air Force had been bloodied and battered, flying into Germany without long-range escort. Hundreds of B-17s had been lost to swarms of Luftwaffe fighters. But now, everything was about to change. On the runways across England, engines thundered as waves of bombers lined up for takeoff. Nearly 1,000 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators prepared to strike deep into the heart of the Reich. Their mission, cripple the German aircraft industry, break the Luftwaffe's spine, and clear the skies for the invasion of Europe. And this time, they weren't alone. The first shadows swept overhead, sleek, fast, and deadly. P-51 Mustangs. Their new, drop-tank-equipped engines gave them the range to escort the bombers all the way to the targets and back. For the Fortress crews, it felt like the sun had finally broken through a storm that had lasted 2 years. Captain Joe McKay of the 379th Bomb Group leaned forward in his cockpit as his B-17 Lucky Strike climbed toward formation altitude. "Look at them, boys," he said, watching the P-51 slide into escort position. "Angels with .50 calories." The radio crackled to life. 8th Air Force, all groups in position. Proceed to target. Over Germany, the flak was thick as ever, black clouds dotting the sky, each one a potential death sentence. The formation held steady, thousands of engines droning in harmony. At 26,000 feet, frost crusted on the gun barrels. Sunlight glinted off canopies. The sky looked almost peaceful, until the first wave of Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s dove in. Fighters. Coming through the middle. Tracer fire stitched across the formation. One B-17 exploded midair, disintegrating in a flash. Another spiraled downward, its wing torn away. But then the P-51s roared in, diving like hawks on the German fighters. "Tally-ho," the escort leader shouted over the radio. "We've got your backs, boys." From his cockpit, McKay watched as a Mustang riddled a 190 with gunfire, sending it smoking earthward. "God bless those Mustangs," he whispered. Despite the chaos, the fortresses pushed on, through flak, through fire, through the black puffs of death. At exactly 11:42 a.m., the lead bombardier called out, "Target in sight." Below lay Leipzig's Messerschmitt factories, sprawling complexes of hangars, machine shops, and airframes in assembly. Bomb bay doors open. Wind howled through the cabin. Bombs away. The fortress shuddered as her payload fell, thousands of pounds of destruction tumbling toward the earth. Moments later, the target vanished beneath waves of explosions. Columns of smoke twisted skyward. Then came the turn for home. The Luftwaffe threw everything they had at the retreating bombers, but the P-51s cut through them like wolves among sheep. By the time the battered formations crossed the English coast, the truth was clear: the tide had turned. In just 6 days, the combined air forces had destroyed or crippled over 600 German fighters and devastated key aircraft plants. The Luftwaffe's ability to defend its skies was broken, not in one battle, but in a sustained storm of steel, courage, and sacrifice. When the crews landed, many wept openly, from exhaustion, from relief, from disbelief that they had survived. The airfields were littered with wrecks, but the sky belonged to them now. The commanders gathered that evening in the briefing hut. Maps were covered in red X's, targets destroyed. Major General Jimmy Doolittle, pipe in hand, stood before them and said simply, "Gentlemen, we've opened the gates of Germany." The Flying Fortress had fulfilled its promise. It had helped shatter the Luftwaffe's strength, paving the way for D-Day, the Allied invasion that would follow months later. But victory hadn't come without a price. Nearly 30,000 airmen had already been killed in action. For every fortress that made it home, another had fallen, taking 10 men with it. Still, the mission continued. Each morning, the engines roared again, and the men climbed aboard their battered, beloved machines, the fortresses that had become both their weapon and their coffin. They flew not for glory, but because the war demanded it. And because they believed that every mile eastward brought the world closer to freedom. Berlin, March 6, 1944, 10:15 a.m. The sky over Germany's capital was boiling with flak. Hundreds of B-17 Flying Fortresses thundered toward the city, their engines straining, their formations tight. From the ground, Berlin looked like it was being swallowed by storm clouds, except this storm was man-made. The Germans had sworn it would never happen, that no American bomber would reach their capital in daylight. They were wrong. Inside the lead ship, 909, of the 91st Bomb Group, Captain Walter Walt Young squinted through the smoke haze. The bombardier, Lieutenant Ray Thorne, hunched over the Norden bomb site, his voice tense over the intercom. Target ahead, Flak Tower at 2 o'clock, range 3 miles. The fortress shuddered under another burst of enemy fire. Shrapnel clanged against the fuselage like hail. The air reeked of cordite and burned oil. "Hold steady, boys," Young said. "This is the big one." Down below, Berlin's defenses erupted, 88mm guns, hundreds of them, firing in perfect rhythm. The sky turned black with smoke and flame. A B-17 on their left took a direct hit, its wing tore free, spiraling downward in slow, terrible silence. "Jesus," the navigator whispered. "They're hitting everything." Young didn't answer. He was staring at the target, the Erkner aircraft plant, one of the Reich's most vital manufacturing centers. Bomb bay doors open. Cold air roared through the fuselage. The crew braced themselves. Steady, steady, bombs away. The fortress lifted slightly as its 8,000-pound payload dropped. Dozens of others followed suit, their bombs falling in synchronized waves. Below, the factory vanished beneath a curtain of explosions. Fire leapt skyward. Then came the voice from the lead ship, "Direct hits. Repeat, direct hits." Cheers broke out across the intercom, brief, nervous, quickly silenced as flak bursts slammed closer. On the way home, the Luftwaffe threw everything they had left. Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, even jet-powered Me-262s, desperate attempts to stem the tide. The air battle stretched for hours, a furious dance of smoke and fire stretching from Berlin to the Rhine. But the fortresses held. When they reached England, only half the force returned. Runways filled with crippled aircraft, engines sputtering, wheels collapsing. Ground crews counted bullet holes in the hundreds. Yet they had done the impossible. For the first time in history, Berlin had been bombed in daylight. General Karl Tui Spaatz sent the message to Washington that night. Mission accomplished. Berlin has felt the weight of the 8th. In the weeks that followed, the raids continued, Leipzig, Munich, Hamburg, and Hanover, a relentless pounding that turned the Reich's industrial heart into rubble. The Luftwaffe could barely replace its losses. Oil refineries burned. Railways shattered. German morale began to crack. In April, a captured German fighter pilot reportedly told his interrogators, "We cannot stop your fortresses. There are too many. You kill us faster than we can climb." But victory came at a staggering cost. Each raid meant dozens of empty bunks in the barracks that night. At mess halls, rows of untouched trays sat waiting for crews that would never return. The surviving airmen stopped asking who was missing. They already knew. They flew mission after mission, their luck thinning with every takeoff. Some counted the number of holes in their plane as if keeping score against fate. Others stopped counting altogether. Yet the Flying Fortress kept flying, limping, burning, bleeding oil, but flying. One war correspondent wrote, "The B-17 is not just an airplane. It's a miracle wrapped in metal. It brings men home when nothing else can." By early 1945, the once invincible Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Allied bombers roamed the skies freely, striking factories, fuel depots, and bridges at will. The Nazi war machine was collapsing. And high above it all, the fortresses kept watch, the same silver birds that had once been doubted, dismissed, even mocked, now leading the charge toward Germany's final defeat. April 1945, over the Ruhr Valley, Germany. The sky was clear for once, no flak, no fighters, no radio chaos. Below, the great factories and steel mills of the Ruhr lay silent, their chimneys shattered, their furnaces cold. The war that had once seemed endless was finally burning itself out. From 25,000 feet, the crew of Little Miss Mischief, a battered B-17 of the 91st Bomb Group, could see the scars of what they'd done: blackened rail yards, cratered highways, rivers choked with wreckage. In the cockpit, Captain Tom Halvorsen looked down through the frost-lined glass and said quietly, "Doesn't look much like the fortress of Europe anymore." His co-pilot, Lieutenant Don Miller, nodded. "More like the graveyard of it." They had flown 28 missions together. Each one had taken a piece of them: friends, nerves, sleep. They were alive, but they carried ghosts with them. The radio operator leaned back, listening to the static hum of an empty sky. For once, there were no mayday calls, no cries for help. Just silence. The war in Europe was ending. The Flying Fortress had done its part, more than its part. From the first raids in 1942 to the last in 1945, it had flown over 290,000 sorties, dropped 640,000 tons of bombs, and earned a place in military legend. But its legacy wasn't measured in numbers. It lived in the stories of survival, of courage and of loss. There was Ye Old Pub, the fortress that limped home across Germany, its nose shattered, half its crew wounded, only to be spared by a German pilot, Franz Stigler, who refused to shoot it down. The two pilots would meet decades later, united not as enemies but as brothers. There was All American, torn nearly in half after a midair collision, yet somehow flying 300 miles back to base. There was Memphis Belle, whose story lifted the spirits of a nation. And then there were the thousands of fortresses that never returned, names painted lovingly on their noses, now resting in the cold fields of Europe. The airmen who flew them were ordinary young men, farm boys, factory workers, mechanics, transformed by the crucible of flight and fire. They had faced odds no one should have survived. And yet, they kept climbing back into those plains, day after day. In May 1945, when Germany finally surrendered, the bomb group celebrated in silence. There were no cheers, no parades on the tarmac. Just the low hum of the last engines winding down. Many walked out to their planes one last time, to touch the cold metal, to whisper thanks, to say goodbye. Captain Halvorsen ran his hand along the scarred fuselage of Little Miss Mischief. "She saved us more times than I can count," he said softly. "She deserves a rest." By summer's end, the warbuds were lined up in rows, stripped of guns, stripped of glory, waiting for the scrapyard. One by one, they were melted down, the same metal that had carried men through hell now destined to become plowshares, bridges, cars. But the spirit of the Flying Fortress didn't fade. In museums, in hangars, in quiet corners of airfields, a few still stood gleaming under the light, symbols of endurance. To veterans, they were more than machines. They were companions. Survivors. Ghosts of a time when the fate of nations rested on wings of aluminum and courage. Even decades later, at air shows and memorials, when the low, thunderous rumble of 4 engines echoes across the field, old men look up with tears in their eyes. Because that sound, that deep, rolling heartbeat of history, still means one thing. The fortress flies again.